The eviction notice was already taped to my dock when I arrived that Tuesday morning, the bright orange paper fluttering in the lake breeze like a warning flag. IMMEDIATEREMOVALREQ IRADUNAUTHORIZEDWATARCERA reamed in bold red letters. Below that, a detailed inventory of my belongings: one 24-foot Chris-Craft, one fishing dock, two kayaks, and apparently my illegal occupation of premium waterfront property. I stared at the notice, my coffee mug trembling in my hands as the reality hit me. Brenda Kellerman and the Lakeside Manor HOA weren't just coming for my boat slip anymore. They were coming for everything. 27 years I'd owned this dock. 27 years of sunrise fishing trips, weekend barbecues, and family memories, stretching back to when my kids were small enough to need life jackets just to walk on the pier. But what Brenda didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 days earlier, I'd signed papers that would turn their entire world upside down. Papers that made me the single largest shareholder in the Lake Morrison Harbor Authority. Papers that meant I didn't just own slip number 47 anymore. I owned the entire damn lake 2 years ago. Everything had been perfect. My name is David Walsh, and after 35 years of teaching high school chemistry, I'd finally retired to the lake house I'd been dreaming about since I was 25. The property sat on a quiet cove of Lake Morrison, about an hour north of Dallas, with a private dock and enough space to finally restore the 1987 Chris-Craft Catalina I'd bought from an estate sale. The boat was my pride and joy, 24 feet of gleaming mahogany and chrome that I'd spent 3 years bringing back to showroom condition. Every weekend, I'd take her out for sunset cruises, sometimes alone with a thermos of coffee and my thoughts, sometimes with my daughter, Sarah, and her kids when they came to visit. The lake house itself was modest but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, and a wraparound deck that looked out over the water. I'd bought it in 1997, long before the area became fashionable, when you could still get waterfront property for what people now paid for suburban starter homes. Back then, the lake was mostly older retirees like myself, weekend fishermen, and families who'd owned cabins for generations. The HOA was informal, run by volunteers who organized the annual fish fry and made sure everyone pitched in for dock maintenance. Dues were $50 a year. Meetings happened in Bob Patterson's garage, and the biggest controversy was usually about whether to allow fishing tournaments on Sunday mornings. That all changed when the developers arrived. Pinnacle Properties bought up 6 lots on the North Shore in 2019, tore down the old cabins, and built what they called luxury lakefront estates, massive modern homes, with infinity pools, outdoor kitchens, and boat slips designed for yachts twice the size of anything that had ever been on Lake Morrison. The starting price was $1.2 million, and every single house sold within 6 months. With the new houses came new residents, and with the new residents came Brenda Kellerman. Brenda was 68 years old, had platinum blonde hair that never moved in the wind, and wore enough jewelry to anchor a small boat. Her husband, Richard, was some kind of investment banker who commuted to Dallas in a Tesla and seemed to view the lake house as a tax write-off rather than a home. But it was Brenda who made it clear from day one that the old, casual way of doing things at Lake Morrison was about to change. "We need professional management," she announced at her first HOA meeting, which she'd moved from Bob Patterson's garage to the community center in town. Property values in this area have increased threefold in the past 5 years, and our management structure needs to reflect that growth. She'd prepared handouts, actual printed handouts with charts and graphs showing comparable HOA fees in similar lakefront communities. The numbers made my head spin: annual dues of $2,400, mandatory dock inspections, approved contractor lists, and something called aesthetic compliance standards that would apparently govern everything from house colors to landscaping choices. "This seems like a lot of changes all at once," said Martha Chen, who'd lived on the lake for 15 years and ran a small pottery studio from her cabin. "Maybe we could implement these gradually." Brenda's smile was sharp as a fishing hook. "Martha, I appreciate your concern, but we're dealing with significant property value exposure here. Without proper management and standards enforcement, we risk creating an environment that drives away quality residents and depresses everyone's investment." Quality residents. The way she said it made my skin crawl. I looked around the room at my neighbors Bob Patterson, who taught me everything I knew about boat maintenance, Martha Chen, whose pottery had been featured in 3 galleries, Tom Rodriguez, a retired Air Force colonel who organized our annual Veterans Day fishing tournament. These were good people who'd built a real community over decades, and Brenda was talking about them like they were obstacles to overcome. But what really caught my attention wasn't Brenda's presentation. It was the man sitting next to her, taking notes on everything that was said. He was thin and nervous-looking, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of expensive suit that screamed lawyer from across the room. "I'd like to introduce my consultant, Marcus Webb," Brenda said, noticing my stare. "Marcus specializes in HOA transitions and will be helping us implement these necessary improvements over the next several months." Marcus Webb nodded and cleared his throat. "What Mrs. Kellerman has proposed is really quite standard for communities of this caliber. The key is establishing clear authority structures and enforcement mechanisms that protect everyone's interests." Authority structures. Enforcement mechanisms. I felt like I was listening to a corporate takeover rather than a neighborhood meeting. The vote was scheduled for the following month, and Brenda made it clear she expected full participation from all property owners. What she didn't say, but what became obvious in the following weeks, was that she'd already lined up enough support from the new residents to guarantee the changes would pass whether the old-timers liked it or not. That was my first hint that this wasn't really about community improvement. This was about control. The new HOA rules passed by a margin of 12 votes to 8, with 3 abstentions. Within a week of the vote, I received my first compliance assessment in the mail, a 4-page document detailing every aspect of my property that needed to be brought up to community standards. My dock was structurally non-compliant and needed to be rebuilt to accommodate larger watercraft. My boat slip required upgraded mooring hardware that met current safety specifications. The Chris Craft itself was flagged for having excessive vintage aesthetic elements that didn't align with the community's modern luxury waterfront image. The estimated cost for all required improvements, $47,000. I read the document 3 times, certain I'd misunderstood something. $47,000 to fix problems that didn't exist on a dock that had been perfectly functional for 25 years. And that was just the beginning. The letter made it clear that failure to complete the improvements within 90 days would result in daily fines of $200, with potential corrective action, including removal of non-compliant vessels and structures. I called the phone number listed on the letterhead and reached Marcus Webb's office. "Mr. Webb, this is David Walsh from Lake Morrison. I received this compliance assessment, and frankly, I think there's been some kind of mistake." "Let me pull up your file, Mr. Walsh." "Yes, I have the report here." "What specific concerns did you have?" "Well, for starters, my dock is only 3 years old. I had it inspected and certified when I installed it. There's nothing structurally wrong with it." "Mr. Walsh, the issue isn't structural integrity, it's compliance with updated community standards. Your dock is designed for smaller recreational craft, but the new standards require slips capable of accommodating vessels up to 35 feet in length. But my boat is only 24 feet long. That's part of the problem. The Aesthetic Compliance Committee has determined that vintage-style watercraft detract from the premium image we're trying to establish. Going forward, all boats in the community should reflect modern design principles and appropriate scale for the property values we're maintaining. I felt my blood pressure rising. Are you telling me I need to get rid of my boat? Not necessarily. If you upgrade your slip to accommodate a more appropriate vessel, you'd be welcome to keep your current boat at a certified marina elsewhere in the area. A certified marina elsewhere in the area. I repeated his words slowly, letting them sink in. Mr. Webb, I've lived on this lake for 25 years. This is my home. I understand the transition can be challenging, but these standards are designed to protect everyone's investment in the community. I'm sure you can appreciate the importance of maintaining property values. The conversation went downhill from there. Marcus Webb had an answer for everything, but none of his answers made any sense beyond generating fees and forcing out longtime residents who didn't fit Brenda's vision of a premium lakefront community. That night, I sat on my dock with a beer and watched the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. The Chris Craft bobbed gently in her slip, her mahogany hull glowing in the evening light. This boat had been my dream project for years, every plank sanded and varnished by hand, every piece of hardware polished to mirror brightness, every mechanical component rebuilt to perfection. They wanted me to get rid of her because she didn't look modern enough. But the boat was just the beginning. Over the next month, I watched as Brenda and her compliance committee systematically targeted every longtime resident on the lake. Martha Chen received a violation notice for her non-conforming garden sculptures, the beautiful pottery pieces she'd been creating for years. Bob Patterson was told his workshop was a commercial operation that violated residential zoning, despite the fact that he'd been fixing neighbors' boats for free since before Brenda knew Lake Morrison existed. One by one, people started to leave. Some sold their properties to avoid the mounting fines and compliance costs. Others, like Tom Rodriguez, fought the violations in court, but eventually gave up when the legal expenses became overwhelming. And through it all, Brenda Kellerman smiled her sharp smile and talked about elevating the community standard, while her consultant Marcus Webb generated endless paperwork designed to make people's lives miserable. But what they didn't realize was that some people don't go quietly. Some people have resources they've been saving for exactly this kind of fight. And some people know how to play the long game better than a bunch of newcomers who think money automatically equals power. I was about to become all three. The morning I found my boat's hull scraped was the moment everything changed. I'd gone down to the dock early, planning to take the Chris Craft out for a sunrise cruise before the lake got busy with weekend traffic. What I found instead was a 3-foot scratch along the port side, deep enough to go through the varnish and into the wood itself. Someone had taken a key or a knife and deliberately damaged my boat. I called the county sheriff immediately. Deputy Susan Rodriguez, Tom's daughter, arrived within an hour, took photos, and filled out a vandalism report. But we both knew the chances of finding whoever was responsible were practically zero. Lake Morrison was isolated enough that someone could do damage and be gone long before anyone noticed. Dad's been telling me about the HOA situation, Susan said as she packed up her camera. Off the record, you're not the first person to report vandalism since the new management took over. We've had 4 other incidents in the past 6 months, all targeting longtime residents who've been having compliance issues. You think it's connected? I can't prove anything, but the pattern is pretty obvious. Someone's sending a message to people who won't play along with the new rules. As Susan drove away, I stood on my dock, looking at the damaged hull and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine anger. Not frustration or annoyance, but cold, focused rage at people who thought they could terrorize their neighbors into submission. The repair estimate was $2,800. Insurance would cover most of it, but that wasn't the point. The point was that someone had deliberately damaged something I'd spent 3 years lovingly restoring, and they'd done it to make me afraid. They'd picked the wrong person to intimidate. That afternoon, I drove into town and made 3 phone calls. The first was to my financial advisor asking about the current status of my retirement portfolio. The second was to a private investigator I'd known since my teaching days, when I'd occasionally testified in cases involving students. The third call was to my daughter Sarah, who happened to be a corporate attorney specializing in property law. "Dad, what you're describing sounds like systematic harassment designed to force property sales," Sarah said, after I'd explained the situation. "It's actually more common than you'd think, especially in areas where property values have increased rapidly. So what do I do about it?" "Well, you could fight the violations individually, but that's expensive and time-consuming. Or you could look at the bigger picture and see if there are any vulnerabilities in their legal structure." "What kind of vulnerabilities?" HOAs derive their authority from state law and their original covenants. If there are problems with how they were established, or if they're exceeding their legal authority, that creates opportunities to challenge the entire system rather than fighting individual battles. Sarah paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Dad, I need to ask you something. How much are you willing to spend to win this fight?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you really want to stop these people, it's going to require more than just defending yourself. You're going to have to go on the offensive, and that could get expensive." I thought about the scratch on my boat, about Martha Chen's tears when she told me she was moving away, about Bob Patterson's defeated expression when he closed his workshop. I thought about 25 years of memories on this lake and the community that Brenda Kellerman was systematically destroying. "Sarah, I've got $800,000 in retirement savings that I've never touched. If it takes every penny to stop these people, then that's what it takes." "All right, Dad. Give me a week to do some research. And in the meantime, document everything. Every letter, every phone call, every incident. If we're going to war with these people, we need ammunition." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my boat was vandalized: hope. For the first time in months, I wasn't just reacting to Brenda Kellerman's attacks. I was planning my own. What I didn't know yet was that the private investigator would uncover something that would change everything. Something that would turn my defensive fight into an opportunity for total victory. But first, Brenda had to make one more crucial mistake. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday in October, just as the leaves were starting to turn, and the lake was taking on that perfect autumn clarity that made every morning feel like a postcard. I was drinking coffee on my deck when the mail truck pulled up, and something about the driver's expression told me this wasn't going to be good news. The envelope was thick and official-looking, with IMME DIATEAAAC TIONREQ IRED stamped across the front in red ink. Inside was a legal document titled Notice of Property Seizure and Vessel Removal, 5 pages of dense legal language that boiled down to one simple message. I had 72 hours to remove my boat from the slip, or the HOA would remove it for me and bill me for storage costs. According to the letter, my continued non-compliance with community standards and failure to complete required dock improvements had resulted in forfeiture of watercraft privileges. The Chris-Craft would be towed to a secure facility at my expense, and my dock access would be permanently revoked pending full compliance with all outstanding violations. I read the document 3 times, my hands shaking with a combination of rage and disbelief. They were actually trying to steal my boat. After 25 years on this lake, after paying property taxes and HOA dues and being a good neighbor to everyone around me, Brenda Kellerman thought she could just take my boat away because I wouldn't play her games. The letter was signed by Marcus Webb as HOA legal counsel and co-signed by something called Lake Morrison Marine Services, apparently the company that would be doing the actual towing. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a note that made my blood boil: property owner may reclaim vessel upon payment of all outstanding fines, completion of required improvements, and settlement of towing and storage fees, estimated at $200 per day. They weren't just taking my boat, they were holding it hostage. I called Sarah immediately. "Dad, slow down," she said, after I'd finished reading the letter in a voice that was probably loud enough to wake half the lake. "Read me the exact legal language they're using to justify the seizure." I went through the document line by line, Sarah asking questions about specific phrases and clauses. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "Dad, I'm not an expert in HOA law, but this doesn't sound right. Homeowners associations have the authority to fine members and place liens on property, but I've never heard of an HOA that could seize personal property like boats or cars. That's usually a government function. So what are you saying?" "I'm saying they might be overstepping their legal authority in a big way. If they don't actually have the right to seize your boat, then what they're threatening is essentially theft." Sarah paused again. "Dad, I need you to do me a favor. Don't respond to this letter yet, and definitely don't move your boat. I'm going to make some calls and see what I can find out about the legal structure of this HOA. In the meantime, start documenting everything. Take photos of your boat in the slip, your dock, everything that shows the current condition of your property." After I hung up, I walked down to the dock and spent an hour photographing every angle of the Chris Craft and the slip. The boat looked perfect in the afternoon light, her mahogany hull glowing like honey, every piece of brass polished to mirror brightness. The idea of some towing company dragging her out of the water with chains and cables made me physically sick. But as I was taking pictures, something caught my eye that I'd never noticed before. On the dock post nearest to shore was a small metal plaque, green with age and almost covered by climbing ivy. I pulled the vines aside and read the inscription: "Lake Morrison Harbor Authority, Slip No. 47 licensed, 1987, renewed 2019. Harbor Authority." Not HOA. Not Lakeside Manor Property Management. Harbor Authority. I took a close-up photo of the plaque and sent it to Sarah with a text message. "Found something interesting. What's a harbor authority?" Her response came back within minutes. "Game changer. Call me tonight." As the sun set over Lake Morrison that evening, I had no idea that the small plaque I'd discovered would become the key to destroying Brenda Kellerman's entire operation. But first, I had to survive the next 72 hours and the showdown that was coming when Marcus Webb's towing company showed up to steal my boat. The private investigator I'd hired was named Janet Mills, and she'd been tracking Marcus Webb's background for 2 weeks when she called me with news that made everything click into place. "David, you need to sit down for this," Janet said. "Your HOA consultant isn't just running a scam at Lake Morrison. He's been doing this for years, all across Texas, and he's finally made a mistake that's going to bring his whole operation down." I poured myself a bourbon and settled into my kitchen chair. I'm listening. Marcus Webb isn't a lawyer. His degree is in business administration, and he's never been licensed to practice law in Texas or anywhere else. What he does is target communities with older residents and unclear property boundaries, then sets up fake HOAs or takes over existing ones to generate compliance fees and force property sales. Fake HOAs? Not exactly fake, but illegitimate. He files the paperwork to make them look official, but he cuts corners on the legal requirements. In your case, the Lakeside Manor HOA was established without proper notification to existing property owners, and their covenants were never properly recorded with the county. I felt a surge of excitement. So they don't actually have authority over my property? It's more complicated than that. But yes, there are serious problems with their legal foundation. But here's the really interesting part. Webb has been involved in at least 6 other similar operations over the past 10 years. 3 of them are currently under investigation for fraud, and 1 resulted in criminal charges for extortion and conspiracy. Janet paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. David, there's something else. The Lake Morrison Marine Services Company that's supposed to tow your boat? It's owned by Webb's brother-in-law, and they've been sued twice for stealing boats under false authority. In both cases, the victims eventually got their boats back, but only after paying thousands in legal fees. The picture was becoming clear. Marcus Webb had found a way to monetize small-town power struggles by setting up quasi-legal HOAs that could generate endless fees and harassment while technically staying within the boundaries of civil law. It was brilliant in its simplicity and absolutely infuriating in its impact on real people's lives. So what's my next move? I asked. That depends on how aggressive you want to get. We could file complaints with the state attorney general and try to get their operation shut down, but that could take years. Or we could hit them where it really hurts their financial backing. Financial backing? Webb doesn't operate alone. He's got investors who provide capital for property acquisitions and legal expenses. If those investors knew their money was being used for potentially criminal activities, they might reconsider their involvement. Janet had done her homework. Over the next hour, she walked me through a complex web of shell companies, real estate partnerships, and investment funds that all traced back to a single source, Pinnacle Properties, the development company that had built the luxury homes on the north shore of Lake Morrison. It's a closed loop, Janet explained. Pinnacle develops expensive properties. Then Webb creates HOA pressure that forces out longtime residents, making their properties available for additional development. The investors make money on both ends, the initial development and the forced property sales. I sat in my kitchen, staring out at the lake, where my boat bobbed peacefully in her slip, and realized I was looking at something much bigger than an HOA dispute. This was organized real estate fraud, and I'd stumbled into the middle of it. But there was still one piece of the puzzle missing: the Harbor Authority plaque I'd found on my dock. When I told Janet about it, her voice got excited. David, I need you to get me the exact text from that plaque and any other documentation you can find about the Harbor Authority. If there's a separate governmental entity that has jurisdiction over the water rights at Lake Morrison, that could change everything. After I hung up, I walked down to the dock with a flashlight and carefully copied every word from the metal plaque. Then I spent the rest of the evening digging through my property records, looking for any mention of harbor authorities or water rights. What I found in a manila folder marked original purchase documents would eventually cost Brenda Kellerman everything she thought she'd built at Lake Morrison. But first, I had to deal with the boat towing that was scheduled for Monday morning. And for that, I had a plan that would require perfect timing and a little help from some old friends who knew how to handle bullies. Saturday morning found me in the dusty archives of the Morrison County Courthouse, wearing my reading glasses and working through decades of property records with the patience I'd learned from 35 years of teaching teenagers. The clerk, a woman named Betty, who'd graduated from my chemistry class in 1994, had given me access to files dating back to the 1950s. Mr. Walsh, what exactly are you looking for? Betty asked as I filled out my third request form for historical documents. Anything about water rights, harbor authorities, or governmental jurisdiction over Lake Morrison, I said. I'm trying to figure out who actually has legal authority over boat slips and dock permits. Betty disappeared into the archives and came back 20 minutes later with a cardboard box that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Inside were original blueprints, survey maps, and government documents related to the creation of Lake Morrison in 1962. What I found in that box changed everything. Lake Morrison wasn't a natural lake. It was created in 1962, when the Army Corps of Engineers dammed Morrison Creek as part of a flood control project. The lake and surrounding waterways were managed by the Lake Morrison Harbor Authority, a governmental entity established by the state of Texas and overseen by an elected board of directors. According to the original charter, the Harbor Authority had exclusive jurisdiction over all water-related activities on Lake Morrison, including boat slips, dock permits, marina operations, and watercraft regulations. Property owners purchased annual dock licenses from the Harbor Authority, not from any private HOA or property management company. But here was the crucial detail. The Harbor Authority had been dormant since 2015, when the last elected board member had moved away and no one had run for replacement. For the past 7 years, the Harbor Authority had existed on paper but had no active leadership or operations, which meant that technically, legally, the Harbor Authority was still the only entity with jurisdiction over my boat slip. Brenda Kellerman's HOA had no more right to regulate lake activities than they did to control air traffic over the county. I photocopied every relevant document and drove home with a feeling of triumph that was tempered by the realization that I still didn't know how to use this information. A dormant governmental authority was interesting from a legal perspective, but it didn't automatically solve my immediate problem. That's when Sarah called with the news that would turn my defensive fight into total victory. "Dad, I've been researching Harbor Authority law, and I found something amazing. In Texas, if a harbor authority becomes dormant due to lack of elected leadership, any qualified property owner can petition to reactivate it by calling for new election." What does that mean? It means you could potentially become the Harbor Authority. If you're elected to the board of directors, you'd have legal authority over all water-related activities on Lake Morrison, including boat slip regulations, dock permits, and marina operations. I felt a slow smile spreading across my face. So instead of fighting Brenda's fake authority, I could establish real authority? Exactly. And here's the beautiful part: harbor authorities in Texas have the power of eminent domain. If the authority determined that certain waterfront properties were being used in ways that conflicted with public water access or lake management, it could theoretically acquire those properties for public use. Sarah paused, and I could hear the grin in her voice. "Dad, if you play this right, you wouldn't just save your boat slip. You could end up owning half the lake." We spent the next 2 hours on the phone, planning a strategy that would make Brenda Kellerman's Monday morning boat seizure the biggest mistake of her life. But first, I needed to make sure the Chris Craft would be protected while I filed the paperwork to reactivate the Harbor Authority. For that, I called in some favors from the only people who understood exactly what Brenda and Marcus Webb were trying to do to our community. Sunday morning dawned gray and misty, the kind of weather that made Lake Morrison look mysterious and primeval. I was on my dock by 6 a.m., checking the Chris Craft's lines and preparing for what might be her last morning in Slip 47, at least until I could sort out the legal mess that Brenda Kellerman had created. But I wasn't alone. Bob Patterson arrived at 6:15, driving his old pickup truck and carrying a thermos of coffee and a tackle box that I suspected contained more than fishing gear. Martha Chen showed up 10 minutes later, followed by Tom Rodriguez and 3 other longtime residents who'd been fighting their own battles with the new HOA regime. "So," Bob said, settling into one of my dock chairs and pouring coffee from his thermos, "Janet tells me you've got a plan that involves some old government paperwork and a lot of nerve." I'd called everyone the night before, explaining what I'd discovered about the Harbor Authority and asking for help with what I was calling Operation Boat Defense. The idea was simple. If Marcus Webb's towing company showed up to steal my boat, they'd find the slip surrounded by witnesses, cameras, and enough legal complications to make them think twice about proceeding. "The paperwork's already filed," I told them, pulling out copies of the documents I'd submitted to the county clerk on Saturday afternoon. I've petitioned to reactivate the Lake Morrison Harbor Authority and called for emergency elections to be held within 30 days. Until those elections happen, the current regulatory status of all boat slips is legally uncertain. Tom Rodriguez examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who'd spent 30 years reading military contracts. This is good work, David. But what happens when Webb's people show up and demand to take your boat anyway? That's where you all come in. I need witnesses to document everything they do, everything they say, and any evidence that they're operating under false authority. If they try to take the boat by force, they'll be committing theft in front of half a dozen cameras. Martha had brought her professional photography equipment. Apparently, her pottery wasn't her only artistic talent. I can get high-resolution images of everything, including close-ups of any paperwork they show you. Perfect. Bob, I need you to be my spokesperson if things get complicated. You've lived on this lake longer than anyone, and you know the history of every property dispute going back decades. Bob grinned. Son, I was handling bullies when Brenda Kellerman was still in diapers. Let them try to intimidate this old crew. By 8 a.m., we had the dock area set up like a documentary film shoot. Martha's cameras were positioned to capture multiple angles. Tom had brought folding chairs, so everyone could be comfortable during what might be a long wait, and Bob had prepared a list of questions designed to expose any weaknesses in Webb's legal authority. At 8:47 a.m., a large pickup truck pulling a boat trailer turned into the lake access road. The truck was white with Lake Morrison Marine Services painted on the sides, and I could see two men in the front seat consulting a clipboard. Showtime, Bob muttered, standing up and adjusting his fishing hat. As the truck approached my slip, I felt a moment of pure clarity. For the past year, I'd been reacting to Brenda Kellerman's attacks, always on the defensive, always trying to protect what I'd built rather than fighting for what I deserved. But this morning felt different. This morning, I wasn't just defending my boat slip, I was taking back my lake. The truck pulled up to the dock, and two men climbed out. The driver was tall and heavy-set, wearing work clothes and the kind of expression that suggested he'd done this kind of thing before. His companion was younger and nervous, constantly checking his phone and looking around at our group like he was trying to figure out what he'd walked into. "Morning, gentlemen," Bob called out pleasantly. "Beautiful day for a boat ride. You folks here for the fishing tournament?" The older man ignored Bob and walked directly to me. "You David Walsh?" "That's right." He handed me a clipboard with a pre-printed form. "We're here to remove the vessel in slip 47. Need you to sign this acknowledging the seizure and releasing us from liability for any damage during transport." I looked at the form without taking the clipboard. "Before I sign anything, I'll need to see your authorization to remove my boat." The man looked annoyed. "We've got a contract with the HOA. That's all the authorization we need." "Actually," Tom Rodriguez said, standing up and walking over, "it's not. Lake Morrison is governed by the Harbor Authority, which is a state governmental entity. Boat seizures require either a court order or specific authority from the Harbor Authority Board." The younger man checked his phone again. "Look, we're just here to do the job we were hired for. The lady said the paperwork was all taken care of." "What lady?" Martha asked innocently, her camera clicking as she documented the conversation. "Mrs. Kellerman from the HOA. She said this guy was in violation and needed his boat removed." I pulled out my copy of the Harbor Authority documents. "Gentlemen, I filed paperwork with the county on Saturday reactivating the Lake Morrison Harbor Authority. Until the legal status of that filing is resolved, no private company has the authority to remove boats from these slips." The older man looked at the documents, then at our group, then back at the documents. I could see him trying to figure out if this was some kind of elaborate bluff or a genuine legal complication that could get his company sued. "I need to make a phone call," he said finally. As he walked back to his truck with his phone pressed to his ear, I realized we'd won the first round. But the real fight was just getting started, and Brenda Kellerman wasn't going to give up easily. What I didn't know yet was that her next move would be so desperate, so legally reckless, that it would give me everything I needed to destroy her entire operation. The phone call the towing company driver made lasted 15 minutes, and I could see him getting more agitated as the conversation progressed. When he finally hung up and walked back to our group, his expression had shifted from annoyed to genuinely concerned. "Look, Mr. Walsh," he said, "there seems to be some kind of legal dispute about who has authority over these boat slips. My company can't afford to get in the middle of a government jurisdiction fight. We're going to have to postpone this removal until the paperwork gets sorted out." Bob Patterson stood up and extended his hand. "Smart decision, son. Legal troubles can get expensive real quick, especially when you're dealing with federal water rights and state harbor authorities." Federal water rights. I almost smiled at Bob's casual addition of federal jurisdiction to the mix, but the towing company driver just looked more worried. Within 20 minutes, the truck and trailer were gone, leaving my Chris Craft safely in her slip, and my defense committee celebrating with fresh coffee and Martha's homemade blueberry muffins. But the victory was temporary, and we all knew it. Brenda Kellerman wasn't the type to give up easily, and Marcus Webb had too much invested in his lake.